product is not a company. I say that a lot because people tend to confuse that. Startups confuse that. So they confuse idea with a product and progression. How do you go from idea to a product and from product to a company, right? So quite often the products succeed, but companies fail. And the difference is having a mature idea and turning that into a product quite often is a big difficulty, right? At what point we're going to stop talking about where we're going to build and we're actually going to start building. That is a concern, and that's an issue, and people typically don't know how to jump from there. So we're going to cover that transition. How do you go from idea to a product? So we're not going to cover how do you go from a product to a company, because company are larger considerations, right? They have everything to do with, you know, putting together a viable team, putting together a process, viable process, avoiding debt of any kind, and so on. So this is going to be more advanced topics. Now, how do you recognize successful startup? It's a good team, it's a good product, it's a market opportunity, sort of makes this a successful startup, and this is what investors are looking for. So for people who are looking for investment, sometimes I hear, I can't find an investment. You can't find an investment because you fail to turn idea into the product, and your product sucks. That's why you can't find investment. So the best way to find an investment is to have a good product. Product should speak for itself. All right, so visuals. Idea description, idea visualization, wireframes, mockups. We're gonna cover all this. So believe it or not, I'm gonna cover a couple of business cases. Now I put it here on purpose. So here's what I do when I have an idea. So when I have an idea, I write it down on paper. And I write it down on paper in my shorthand notation that I'm gonna hand into to the designer. Now, here's the idea that I had, and I'm not sure if you can recognize was just a bunch of words thrown there. But the idea was, is it possible to put together a system to predict a success of the startup? So as it turns out, it's a super complex problem. Now, I said, okay, well that's super complex. Is it actually possible to predict failure? Can we look at the startup and predict failure? So this was just an idea that I had. So I decided to describe it to the designer to visualize it. So this is the first thing that I do. Visualizing the idea is great, and you will see why later. So I'm not sure if you're going to count. There's 51 words in here, and you will understand why the number makes a difference. So I called it a success calculator, which I said basically it's an inventor with a cloud over the head. Many factors go into the circles, and representing founder experience circle and previous startup experience. So they go into this box and comes out a score that basically says you're going to be successful or you're going to be a failure, right? So it's more complex than that, but really that's the idea, right? Let's write the software and you guys will come, you give us your ideas, and we tell you don't even start, right? So at this point it's hopeless, right? So here's what the designer turned it into. Right, so he looked at it and basically said, "Great, I have a founder with the bulb over his head, and there are just things going into, and they go into a box, and what comes out is just basically a score." And I said, "Oh, I'm really happy with that picture. I'm just gonna tell the designer a couple of things, and this is the way we communicate. We communicate by me redlining." Hey, sorry. We communicate by me redlining the picture, right? So until I turned it into a perfect picture that I actually like. So now this picture represents my idea. So I recommend that people start that way, right? So it kind of crystallizes your thinking, and also if you show this to others and they can't understand what that means, you kind of failed right there, right? Because your picture has failed to communicate exactly what your idea is. So going from there, now this is also something that was taken from a real startup, right? So startup was conference by wire, and it was all about remote conference attendance. So if I want to attend a conference remotely, I just log in, and my live feed is going to start, and I'm going to watch the conference. That's the idea of the startup. So difference between wireframes and mockups. So this is a wireframe. I put this together, and I gave it to the designer, and I said, I need something to look pretty. Can you do something for me? And this is what he came up with. Now, what he came up with was 10 times worse than that, right? We just, through the process of red marking, we just came to this, right? So we turned this into this. Now, this is going to be, it's going to be critical. Why is this going to be critical? Because even though I took these are the mock-ups that later on the developers were using in order to implement the system. And I insisted they would be pixel perfect, right? So they would reflect exactly this. So I knew exactly what my product is going to look like. I basically, so when I was pitching the idea, I was making the assumption, I was telling everybody it's already built. This is exactly how it looks, right? So, and getting their feedback. Any questions there? So it's just fairly simple, right? So this was one of the screens. The actual solution had, I think, about 10 screens, right? So there were a number of different options, but that's what it was. And then basically the process went like this. Of me initially coming up with a description of the idea, coming up with a visual, and then from a visual coming up with wireframes and mockups. So clickable prototype. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in front of the computer, but after the presentation, this looks deceptively like a mock-up, but it's not. It's actually a clickable prototype, and you will be able to see it. So it's fully functional, non-functional prototype. So what that means is all the data is hard-coded. So this is basically a music streaming application. So it consists of an HTML5 prototype that you can click through from screen to screen, and it demonstrates the full functionality. Right? So it's cheap to build. I can hire an HTML5 designer or HTML designer or developer, however you see it, to come up with one. And once they do come up with one, then I can go and basically nobody knows. Then in the back end, it's just not functional, right? It just does connect one screen to another, right? So again, later on I'll pull it up and you'll be able to see it looks functional. It looks very, very functional. You should invest in doing this, right? So it seems a little superfluous. You come up with wireframes, and why would you put something like this together? Because when you're putting together usability, plays into effect, right? And it might give you extra ideas in terms of how the people are going to be using this, and putting in front of others something like this can be very instrumental.
What's the cost of doing this as opposed to a finished product?
Mm-hmm.
Percentage-wise, or what?
So producing something like this cost, if I remember correctly, like $450. So building a prototype can be tens of thousands of dollars, right? So this absolutely makes sense. And as a matter of fact, once you actually have wireframes, you have mock-ups, connecting them together is not a difficult task. So you should definitely do that. Questions? Sorry, I think I'm blocking, completely blocking the. We're good?
Okay.
All right. So what are the prototyping tools that you could use? Now my favorite tools are basically Lucidcharts and Serena Prototype Builder, but these are sort of representations. Some of them are paid tools, like Mockingbird and Mockflow, but they're all sort of have entry versions which are really, really cheap. So in other words, if you're saying that I'm not going to do this because this is expensive, that's a wrong argument, right? It's not expensive at all. Yes, go ahead.
Will the slides be available on SlideShare?
Yes, I can make them available on SlideShare. No worries. Yes, so there's going to be a lot of these, like what are the tools and so on. So I'm going to make them available so you can try out the tools.
I have a question.
Yes.
So this is mainly just for software, correct? This is mainly for software.
Software,
If you're making a software
wireframe.
product, if you're making a software product, but if
That's
you're making
right.
a hardware product, you can do the same, right? You can draw it.
Yes, well, you should draw it, right? So you should draw the experience. Now, I don't have as much experience in doing, like, all the prototyping I did would be actually the prototype I did for my pump. So it would be me there with the wire gun doing 2,000 connections. That was my prototype. It looked like a